Before.
Either way, let's get going. So we've been discussing some issues relating to, halacha's perspective on philanthropy and tzedakah, altruism, and in particular to the question of, how voluntary or, possibly enforced that could be. The truth is that, we've been discussing two aspects of tzedakah, or really three. One, of course, is nidrei tzedakah, pledges. That's caused a little confusion in our discussion, but the confusion is partly due to the sources and due to the interrelationship of these ideas. That is, what is the relationship between a pledge that a person makes to give tzedakah and the minimum obligation that he has, every year to contribute some of his earnings or some of his holdings to tzedakah, based on the pasuk, nasom titein or pasoach tiftach. There are really, three elements. In the parsha of Nedarim, the Torah speaks about motzas fasecha tishmar biasisa. That means that if you make a pledge, motzas fasecha, whatever comes out of your mouth, tishmar, right? You should, you should treat it very seriously. Biasisa. Biasisa doesn't just mean, make it so. Biasisa, according to Chazal, this is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, and it's amplified by the Ritva. Biasisa means you can force someone to do it. Not only you can do it, but you can be the, motivating force by someone else doing it. So biasisa, typically understood this way, reflects enforcement or coercion. So one parsha in the Torah, and one source speaks about nidrei tzedakah, like a pledge. You have a campaign in a shul or whatever, and people make a pledge. That pledge is nidrei tzedakah, and it has a certain, important status. The question is, is nidrei tzedakah more about nedarim, more about other commitments? Is the primary, legal responsibility the fact that you made the commitment? You might have made a different kind of a commitment. Are all commitments, part of the same story? Or is the content of certain commitments, like here, it's a commitment to tzedakah? So it may be more of a tzedakah halacha than a nedarim halacha. Just to highlight that, the Rambam speaks about nidrei tzedakah, also in Hilchos Matnos Aniyim. Matnos Aniyim is where the Rambam speaks about tzedakah from chapter 7. The Rambam has a whole other section where he speaks about, just purely nedarim, commitments, Hilchos nedarim. So one issue is tzedakah pledges. Another issue is the obligation, the mitzvah aseh, that the Torah in Parshas Re'eh speaks about, twice and in double fashion, nason titein pasoach tiftach, the obligation to give tzedakah, and that's more like a regular mitzvah aseh. In other words, you have to fulfill that and execute it, just like you have to listen to the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and you have to, take the Daled Minim on Sukkot, and many other mitzvahs aseh. Though it comes from within. The person who's being addressed is the donor, and he's being told, give some of your material belongings when you have the wherewithal. Of course, there's a recipient. You give it la'aniyacha to vioni amecha, but basically that's where you mail the check. And as far as that is concerned, this is what we explained last week, for the Rambam at least. One of the makoros of the mitzvah aseh is v'hechzakta bo ger v'toshav v'chayimach. So one of the psukim speak about a ger toshav. Ger toshav is not a Jew. A ger toshav is a righteous Gentile who has committed formally in the presence of a bezdin that he will observe the Sheva Mitzvah Noach, that he will avoid Avodah Zarah and so on. That's a ger toshav. So the chiddush of citing the source, the hechzakta bo ger v'toshav v'chayimach, is that the obligation to give, includes a ger toshav as well. And that's not, we were talking, Rabbi Roth brought up last week, Mishum Darke Shalom, that's Mefarnasin Aniyeh Yaakov Mimaniyeh Yisrael, that's a Gemara in Git and Daf Samech, Mipnei Darke Shalom. That's already a different thing. That's not a biblical obligation. That's a separate category. In any case, so we have Nidrei Tzedakah.
I was making a distinction between a real moral principle of obligation, right, and a pragmatic principle.
Yeah, no, correct. And what I think I pointed out last week, that it's interesting that the Rambam codifies the din of Mefarnasin Aniyeh Yaakov Mimaniyeh Yisrael in two different places. In Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, he explains Mipnei Darke Shalom in, like you say, in a very pragmatic way. But in Hilchos Malachim, he does quote the pasuk of Dirachecha Darchei Noam V'chol Nesivasecha Shalom, which is a principled explanation. That's a very interesting. My theory has always been that it starts off one way and then it evolves into something else, and that's why the Rambam speaks about the same halacha in two different places. I think what he's saying is, that from a tzedakah point of view, it's pragmatic, Aniyeh Yaakov, that is. That's why he writes about it in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim. But in Hilchos Malachim, where he's talking about the general relationship that we have, with Umos Ha'olam, and he's talking about the opportunity to Mekadesh Shem Shamayim, there he just, it's like once you're doing it the way that you could do it, it could end up being Duracha Darchei Noam B'chol Nesivasecha Shalom. But it's very challenging issue because he does formulate the same halakha in two different places, which is rare for the Rambam. The Rambam's organizational genius was such that there's rarely duplication in Yana Chazaka, and when there's always a good conceptual reason why. And here I think but here it's not only that it's duplicated and it's differentiated, right? It's formulated differently. Anyway, so the second category, I'm not talking about the Aniyeh Yaakov now, but that we're just mentioning en passant. But the second category, so the first one is Nidrei Tzedakah, and the second is the Mitzvah. And then the third category are the two psukim in Parshas Re'eh that refer to tzedakah in the negative, meaning the lav. That's lo ta'ametzes levavcha, don't harden your heart, and lo tikpots es yadcha, do not withdraw your hand. So what I was trying to explain was that, the Rambam, when he formulates that halakha, number one, he emphasizes unduly. What do I mean by unduly? It wasn't necessary for him to accentuate this point, and therefore the fact that he does makes it very important. He stresses the encounter with an ani. He says, if you encounter an ani, al yalim, eincha mimenu, as if to say that, there are two completely different ideas. One comes internally, like, you have like a to-do list. Everybody has a mitzvah to-do list, you have to buy a lulav, and you have to build a sukkah, and you have to hear shofar, and you have to do many other mitzvahs. And part of the mitzvahs, among the mitzvahs you have to do is a mitzvah of tzedakah. But the lav is not part of a to-do list. The lav is a consequence of the experience of confronting someone in need. And that, reality, being faced with that, experiencing it, triggers its own obligation, and that's a lav. And by the way, in my opinion, I'll just add, from a parshanut point of view, the language that the Torah uses in Parshas Re'eh is so beautiful, in capturing this, because lo ta'ametz livavcha, don't harden your heart, implies, that you're already in the context of this encounter. And the question is, you can almost visualize it. How is it going to go? Is your heart going to melt? Is your heart, going to harden? And the same thing is true with lo tikpot es yadcha means don't withdraw your hand, meaning your hand is, already outstretched, or, practically. And then the question is, are you going to withdraw it? Meaning you're already in the implication of the language is that you're already in the framework of the context of, this, decision, this confrontation. And now the question is, what are you going to, are you going to kind of shy away from your responsibility. So while the assay is internal and requires that you find a proper, good, method or destination to fulfill to discharge your obligation, the lav is all about, it's all about turning your back. It's all about, a bittul of tzedakah. It's all about refusing, to respond to an obligation that already exists. So I think it's no coincidence. Let me just wait one more second, and then I'll take the question. And therefore, it's no coincidence that the Rambam in Perek Zayin, Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, Halacha Beis, when he talks about the lav, says, just going to read the language for a moment, and then I promise I'll take the question. Kol haroeh ani mevakesh, which is his introduction, which, he made that up, meaning he understood that deeply from the pasuk. Kol haroeh ani mevakesh, he experiences an individual who is in need and who is seeking. Vehelim einav mimenu. This is the language of the Rambam. Lishono hazahav, as they say. It's always amazing, especially when you know the Makoros, and then you see what the Rambam does with it. And he ignores this, like you can almost visualize, like he's turning away from him. V'lo nasan lo tzedakah. It's not that he didn't give; he doesn't. He actively rejects. But if you look in the lav in Sefer Mitzvos, the Rambam adds a word, which again, it's our job to pick up on the clues, and to read these sources, with a magnifying glass, because otherwise we miss so many things. So HaMitzvah Reish Lamed Beis, this is the last entry of the first Mar Makomos on this topic. We're going to go in a minute to the second one that I gave out last week. HaMitzvah Reish Lamed Beis, He Shehiziranu, the Rabbanu Shalom, the Torah warned us, Shelo Limnoa, also an interesting language, don't withhold. Withhold doesn't just mean abstain. It's like you're withholding it. Like he deserves it. It's his, and you're withholding it from him. That's the language. V'harchava me'avyonim me'achenu. That's the key word. Once you know of their plight, if they are achenu, our brother. So what happened here in Mishnah Torah, right? In Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam makes it clear that a ger toshav, is included in the mitzvah haseh of nason tita. It's Perek Zayin halacha aleph. In Sefer Mitzvos, the Rambam makes it clear that the lav applies only to achenu. Why? Because there are two different types of obligations. In one case, it's it's your to-do list. You have to do good works. Part of good works is supporting and sustaining, institutions or individuals, who need your help. It's a range of things. And ger toshav's on the list. Why not? Ger toshav is a very admirable, individual. But the lav, which is about you have no right to turn down or withhold or to withdraw or to harden, to withdraw your hand or harden your heart, that's only achenu. Because how can any other human being, how can any fellow, human demand of us that we support him? That doesn't make any sense. You didn't make him poor. You didn't impoverish him. You work hard for your own material goods. The halacha recognizes profoundly, the power of ownership and the right for accumulation. Right. So I talked about that last week. I think that's what you're picking up on. In other words,
the Torah is telling you that maybe you didn't make him poor, but your existence and his existence are part of one creation.
Right. So I don't know if you were last week, but I spoke about Galgal HaChozer, the Gemara in Shabbos. It's like like a revolving fund, like everybody's family at some point or another goes through difficulties. And, there's always what goes around comes around, they say. So, that is a perspective. But I think it's more than that. That's a pragmatic idea or a way to soften the blow. But I think it also, you're right. I think you're quite right. I think it means more than that. But what I think it's really based on is Kol Yisrael Arevim, either Zelazeh or Zebazeh, and V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And this idea that all of Klal Yisrael is a family, when you think it on a family level, let's say your brother, your son, your daughter, whatever, your sister are in need. So you're going to say, well, we believe in ownership. We believe in the right to accumulate. I have no responsibility. So the chiddush of tzedakah and Klal Yisrael is not so much that we demand, choshen mishpat, meaning financial support. We demand that you dip into your own, hard-earned, material success in order to support someone else. That isn't so much the chiddush. The chiddush is that every Jew, is a brother and a family member. And therefore, that becomes just much more logical.
So
I mentioned this in the past, but
there's no hierarchy?
Oh, of course there's a hierarchy.
No, I mean, there is ircha, and but I mean, within your community.
There's a hierarchy, of course. There are tons of hierarchies.
No, but once you're
as I said last week,
my neighbor is better than the guy in the other part of town. Is my family better than my neighbor?
Yes, so that's true. And there always needs to be a hierarchy. However, what I tried to explain last week was one of the chidushim of the hierarchy of tzedakah is that it's not a zero-sum game. In other words, it's not that you have level one, let's say you have, let's say we can break it all down to 3 levels, right? Level 1, level 2, level 3. So you might have thought that as much tzedakah money as you have to give, you have, you have $20,000.
Give it to level 1.
So you have to give first. You give it to level 1. When you finish with level 1, you go to level 2. But that's not the case. That's not the case. There should be, right? Yeah. There should be a higher. And by the way, so why is that? I think the answer is exactly what we're saying now, which is because while there's a hierarchy, and that makes sense, meaning it's a fascinating thing. All of Klal Yisrael is a family, and there's a recognition that that family within family is even more family. But since everybody is still family, you can't ignore any of the shechvot, any of the populations. Meaning, you on the one hand have to make the distinctions as a matter of hierarchy and priority, because it's not really true to say, and then halacha proves this as well. I mean, psulei kurva don't apply to every member of Klal Yisrael. There would be no edus.
Are we saying what applies on a macro basis may not apply on a micro basis?
No, what I'm saying is,
in other words, the klal, and for the klal, these
the relationship. What I'm saying is what I'm saying is that even though the macro is family, part of being family is to recognize that the micro is the first level of family. But because it's all family, it's not a zero-sum game. If you were to only relate to the level 1, and only get to number 2 when you finish with number 1, then in some respects you would be diluting or diminishing, the family theme of Klal Yisrael. On the other hand, if there was no hierarchies, and you were saying, that some Jew I never met, deserves the exact level of support that my brother deserves, then in the end of the day, you wouldn't be able to treat that other fellow as a brother either, because your notion of brotherhood would be so fatally compromised, that it just wouldn't work. So the perfect solution, this is my theory, but the perfect solution is that when you have this expansive idea, but within, and therefore you have to relate on some level to the expansion, meaning to Klal Yisrael, but that itself demands, a first, level attention, to the real relationships, that exist. And that's a very important, that's why.
It's talking to us.
That's why Aniyei Mishpach. What's that?
When the Torah is talking to us as a community or as an individual?
Both. Well, there really are 2 parshas of tzedakah. One in, the end of Vayikra.
No, what I'm saying is when it says you should do this or you should do that, so the community as a whole should take care first of this, second, third. But when a guy comes over to me as an individual, do I make that same
there is
calculation?
That's a great question. I mean, there is the law of the Rambam is about a confrontation. So that creates a certain urgency. And there's also the Gemara on the basis of the pasuk, and the Rambam quotes this as well. Al tashev dach nichlam, as I think how the pasuk goes, which is, if somebody confronts you, you should give them something. Now, again, I don't think that means.
In other words, don't be heartless.
Yeah, don't be heartless, and don't, how much you give him. Also, I think if we have a problem in our society, with fraud. I mean, I think there was always a problem of fraud in tzedakah because it's kind of built in. People,
bad guys and good guys.
Yeah, there always have been. We know that from the beginning of Sefer Bereshis, and Chamas has always been a weak spot of people. So when we say Al Tashiv Dach Nichlam, it doesn't mean, in my opinion, it doesn't mean that, that if somebody is fraudulent, that you have to give him. And it doesn't mean if he's asking 100 people, at the time, that everybody has to give him either. I mean, there's nothing wrong, you could give it. But what it really, really means, it's important, again, it's important to know what these things mean so people can observe them, I think properly, and tafasta merubalo tafasta. But if you do, if the chazaka is that somebody is, on the level, and he has a relationship with you, or he's appealing to you personally, you're not walking around a room, appealing to 100 people at a time. So, it would be very humiliating, or he's on the, he's in a car and he's, and 5 people and they're, going from house to house to house to house, try to help those people too. But I don't think that's what al tashev dach nichlam means. What it really means is like there's a personal aspect to the, to the entreaty, and that it would be perceived as, humiliating to that person, if you were to reject it, would be like a personal rejection. So there are many, issues, but the bigger point I'm trying to make in terms of what you're asking me about the zero-sum game and the hierarchy is that because the foundation here of my obligation to share my material success with someone else, has like this family connotation driving it, for that reason, the more real, the family connection, you can't ignore that. If you were to ignore it, the whole thing would fall apart, frankly. But at the same time, you can't relate to that exclusively, because then you'd never be able to, express and manifest this wider idea of Haftal Reacha Kamocha or Reacha, which is at the bottom of it. This is why the Ramban, by the way, this is the famous comment of the Ramban. The Ramban in a couple of places, he talks about Shmitas Ksafim, which is coming up, also an extraordinary chesed, right? Every member of Klal Yisrael is supposed to, I'm talking about before Prisbal, right? Forgive outstanding debt that likely was, interest-free to begin with. So it was already an act of tzedakah. And, after the end of the 7th year of the Shemitah year, Shmitas Ksafim, he's supposed to forgive that debt, to waive it. That's a very extraordinary thing. Now, the Gemara says that, the lova is supposed to, offer, to pay anyway. And then there's like this whole exchange between the lova and the malva. And, we could talk about it at some point. But either way, the Ramban discussing Ribis and the Ramban discussing Shmitas Ksafim, and noting how the Torah says in both cases, with regard to Ribis, the Torah says, L'nochri tashich. And with regard to Shmitas Ksafim in Parshas Re'eh, the Torah says, L'nochri tigos. It says, Lo yigos sachicha, but L'nochri tigos. So the Ramban is troubled. The Ramban says, what is this discrimination? You're supposed to collect the debts of a non-Jew, or you're certainly allowed to, maybe even you're according to the Rambam, you're supposed to charge, interest. Like, what is that? The Ramban says, after all, Gezel Akum is prohibited, Doraisa, not allowed to steal from a non-Jew. So the Ramban says, basically the Ramban says, take a step back and understand that you're taking this out of context, because the whole thing is a remarkable.
It's exceptional to begin with. You can do it to everybody. It's exceptional that you're not allowed to do it to your fellow.
Right. So the Ramban says this is something you would do to your family member, not to a stranger. So the chiddush of the Torah is that all of Klal Yisrael is your family. I mean, I'm reformulating a little bit. So it's not discrimination, that it doesn't extend outside. It's extraordinary that extends, to the outer reaches of every member of Klal Yisrael.
Are all of these exceptional rules to some degree like what we have with Shluach HaKhan, so to speak, to teach us to have certain kind of personality and certain kind of
what I've been trying to, that's a great question.
Towards humanity?
So I think that is part of it. Maybe that's part of the Mitzvah Saseh part of it. And the Rambam actually in Sefer HaMitzvos does have the following line. If you look at the last Mar Makom of the previous Mar Makomos, page 4, Sefer HaMitzvos Mitzvah Reish Lamed Beis. I quoted it before to show you that the lav is only in Achinu. It's just interesting to notice. I said before that the language of the Rambam is always, extraordinary. So this is just totally gratuitous. You didn't have to add this. But the last words of the Rambam in Reish Lamed Beis is, B'zeh azhara, this lav is an azhara, a warning, or a hedge against, miliknos midas hakilus v'hakzarius shatimona mi'asos haraoi. So it's almost like, you're working, in collusion with the Rambam here, because that's exactly what he says. He says, and by the way, this, one of the purposes of this is to build character. Now, in my opinion, he doesn't think that it's only to build character. I think it really, primarily, as I say, is about this relationship of, a family expanding out into Shkenim, expanding out into the Tzibur, and all members of Klal Yisrael. But I think what the Ramban is saying is that either way, and maybe this is connected. The Ramban, as I think I mentioned maybe 2-3 weeks ago when we started this broader theme, that, when the Torah uses the expression in Parshas Re'eh, lo yera levavcha b'sitcha lo, right? You shouldn't, put a dark face, we'll call it, on when you give tzedakah. What does that mean? But it's not just what does it mean. The Ramban counts it. Ramban is critical of the Rambam. He thinks that lo yera levavcha b'sitcha lo, that you shouldn't feel badly when you give over money to tzedakah. He thinks that belongs in the minyan mitzvos. I mean, the Rambam counts 2, an aseh and a lav for tzedakah. The Ramban thinks there's an aseh and a lav, and there's also lo yera levavcha b'sitcha lo. But what does it mean, lo yera levavcha b'sitcha lo? So the Ramban says what it means is, don't think that when you give tzedakah that you come out as a loser.
The short end.
That you comes out on the short end, that you're sacrificing. No, not true. I mean, why not? It is true, isn't it? I mean, you get schar, but I think partially the answer is this line in the Rambam. There's also cultivation of good character through this. And that's important. I think that's what Rabbi Akiva meant when he answered Tanis Rappas. Again, if you go back to the Mar
Isn't this also part of one of the hierarchy of the Rambam? When he says about giving tzedakah, he goes down.
The Rambam says you should give the same upon the meal.
Yeah.
But the Ramban is saying more than that. That's how the Smag interprets that you should give it with a good attitude, in the sense that you should be kind and empathetic, and you shouldn't be making the ani self-conscious. But the Ramban is saying much more than that. The Ramban is saying, when you look in the mirror and you think about it yourself, and b'chadrei chadar, not when you give the money to the ani. When you think about, I just gave away.
He did you a favor.
You're thinking like, I worked hard for that money. Now I had to give it away in the midst of tzedakah. What can I do? And the Ramban is saying it's almost impossible to do this because it's very hard. But the Ramban is saying, don't think that way. He's not talking about the attitude that you display towards the ani. That's the smag. That's what the Rambam is speaking about. For the Ramban, it's more like your hashkafa should be. It's like a little bit like the discussion. Do you remember? I'll just go over it for a second. The first Mar Makom of the first sheet on this topic, the second Mar Makom, is the discussion of Rabbi Akiva and Tanis Rappas. So it starts off with Imalokechem Oivaniyim Mipnei Ma Eina Mefarnesam. And then the Gemara says, Amar lo kadesh nitzolanu mihen midina shel Gehenna, which means that the Tarnas Rapa said, if your God, is so enamored with the poor, so why doesn't he feed them? Right? Good question. I mean, a bit of a crude question, but so the answer Rabbi Akiva gave him was, you got it all wrong.
We should have the opportunity.
Exactly. We should have the opportunity. So put that together with the very nice peroration of the Rambam at the end of the Losase that I just read to you. And again, what you were talking about is a great example of it also. You were talking about Shiloh Hakan, right? That's the Ramban on Shiloh Hakan. I mean, the Ramban in Parshas Chukas, when he talks about Shiloh Hakan, tries to explain what it means when we say that Ha'omer al kan sipor, the Gemara says in Megillah and in Brachos, Ha'omer al kan sipor yagiu rachamecha mishaskenosel. Meaning, if somebody says, "Oh, the mitzvah of kan sipor to take away the mother and the chick, you shouldn't, one shouldn't see the taking away the other, right?" If anybody says about that, "Ach yagiu rachamecha," that it's an expression
that appears in the Mishnah also.
Yeah, it's in the discussion in Megillah. Now, Yagiu Rachamecha, Mishaskenosa, you quiet him. So the Gemara says there are two reasons. One reason is She'osa Midosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Rachamim Be'enon Ela Gzeros, because he's kind of turning the Rabbanu Shalom's mitzvos into just expressions of compassion, and they're more than that. They're Gzeros Hashem. What does that mean? What's wrong with being compassion? So this is the Ramban's explanation. Ramban says, of course it's compassion, but there are two types of compassion. There's compassion in the narrower sense, like, oh, you're saving the whales, you're saving the birds, you're saving the, Spock, the pup, you don't want him to feel bad. So, you're doing something for Spock. That's one kind of compassion. Says the Ramban, that's a narrow compassion. That's not what mitzvahs are for. But to refine your character, for you to be able to cultivate the midah of Rachmanos, if you're cruel to animals, then you can only be cruel to animals if you're a cruel person, essentially. So by demanding that you do something that is compassionate, it's not the birds that are the focus here.
Also, Espino falls in the same category, right?
What?
Also, Espino falls in the same category, no?
Possibly, probably. Anyways, so these are some of the issues that we've been discussing. So there really are three motifs in tzedakah that we've been discussing: nidrei tzedakah, mitzvah aseh of tzedakah, and the lav of tzedakah. And the lav of tzedakah.
There's an aspect of kiddush Hashem in this, in giving tzedakah to a non-Jew as well.
Well, that's part of the Mefarnas and Aniyeh. The darkest, again, the darkest shalom of the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim is a kind of a kiddush Hashem. I think that's true.
And
but
also,
on the other hand, Rabbi, if the mitzvah is that we can do neshech on a non-Jew, then it's not a kiddush Hashem. That's a chilul Hashem.
Well, no, this is what I was saying in the name of the Ramban.
We didn't do anything bad.
The Ramban says, isn't this discrimination? So the Ramban says, no, it's not discrimination. Requiring that you, abstain from taking interest from a Jew is an extraordinary family chesed.
No, that I understand, but when it comes to a non-Jew.
Right, if you were, think of it this way, if you were to apply the same level of generosity, to every stranger that, and to members of your family, that would be inappropriate. That's what the Ramban is saying. In other words, you have to treat, that's why I was answering the no-sum game question before about there being a hierarchy. But, we don't exhaust the hierarchies. We kind of, incorporate them in resource allocation, of a more complex nature, because, otherwise it would be, we wouldn't get there, and we would be, but you have to acknowledge hierarchy. By the way, Rashi says this, I'm getting a little afield, but there's a tshuva of Rashi that's quoted in the Hagos Maimunios in Hilchos Megillah. Rashi was asked, what about matanos levyonim for a non-Jew? Can you give matanos on Purim? right? There's Mishloach Manos, Matanas Levyonim, right? So Rashi was asked Rashi wrote tshuvas too. We have some of his tshuvas. So he was asked, what about giving can you fulfill the mitzvah of Matanas Levyonim by giving to a non-Jew? And Rashi said, no. Not because there's anything wrong per se with giving a non-Jew. You give charity to a non-Jew. But Matanas Levyonim was intended to be an expression of the special fraternity of Klal Yisrael and everything they went through. Yesh Am Echad, Mifozar Farad Mibeinu Amim, Mi Odeim La'is Kazo Sigat L'Malchus, Knos HaYehudim. It's all about the special bond between and the responsibility, that each Jew has for every other Jew and the common destiny that we share. So Rashi, I'm adding a lot to what Rashi says. He just writes like 2 lines. But basically what he's saying is, if there were, it sounds good, sounds very liberal, we'll extend Matanas Levyonim to non-Jews. But if you do that, then it's no longer an expression of the unique family bond that all Jews share. If you were to treat every, person that with exactly the same intense, affection and loyalty that you treat your family members, that it might seem, extraordinarily, wonderful. But in the end of the day, you would, by doing that, you would be losing, the capacity to, to emphasize the importance of family bonds.
I always thought that Matanas Levyonim on Purim was to enable the Evyonim to enjoy Simchas Purim. If you're giving it to a non-Jew, you're not enabling him to enjoy.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, the Gemara does have cases of Matanas Levyonim, which were like, overlapped with Mishloach Manos. But the way the Rambam understands, what? Mishloach Manos. Yeah, but it's Ish L'Reu. But the Rambam, where the Rambam form, again, we're getting very far afield now, but look at the very end of Hilchos Megillah, the Rambam says far more important than Mishloach Manos is Matanas Levyonim, because the umlalim and the nidkaim is a language, again, beautiful, beautiful language. The umlalim and nidkaim who have lost faith, and are in humanity, if you're able to support them and able to uplift them, then in a way, what you're doing is, divine-like. So the Rambam actually, his formulation of Matanas Levyonim is not connected to the celebration of Purim. I think there are some Gemaras and some poskim who do say something very similar to what you're saying. And if you did say that, I think it would be a great answer to that question. I hadn't thought of that previously. I think it's a good point, but it wouldn't work for the Rambam. And I think what Rashi says is, it's one of those things. Sometimes, you have a question and then you hear an answer. And when you hear the answer, you just know it's right. So like what the Ramban says about Ribbis and Shmitas Ksafim, and what Rashi says about, Matanas Levyonim, and, what I'm trying to extend in a much more subtle way about, how to navigate priorities and hierarchies in Tzedakah, it's all kind of one, broader principle. It's what I call the idea of concentric circles. You have to, it's true in Talmud Torah too, V'shinantam levanecha, and banecha means talmidecha. But your first obligation is to your children. You have to hire a malamed, to teach your children. Actually, you don't have to hire a malamed to teach the neighborhood's children. I mean, if you can, that would be helpful. But as an obligation, Vishinanta Levanecha means Talmidecha. The answer is the pshat, is also important. Meaning it starts with Banecha, and then it extends to Talmidecha. But if you ignore your Banecha, you're probably not, you're probably not going to be an effective Talmidecha, Banecha person either. So you have to, in all these things, there are priorities, but the priorities in many of these cases are not mutually exclusive of an extended or expanded application. For the same reason that you have priorities, it's important also to broaden your your largesse or your teaching or your influence in the community. But that doesn't mean that there aren't priorities, and it's important. Again, it's a little complicated, but it's important to address both of these aspects. Okay, so these are the aspects of tzedakah that we were thinking about, and I just want to highlight just a couple of more sugyas just to zero in on a few other issues a little bit in the time that we have left. So let's turn our attention also for now. We need both of the marmakomos, but not the added marmakomos from last week, but the ones still from the week before. If we could look at the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah on Daf Dalid and Daf Vav. This is on page 2. Again, not the most recent marmakomos on tzedakah, but the ones before that. Everybody with me? Hopefully.
I'm going to get the Gemara. That's the best.
So this is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. So let's look at this Gemara on Daf Dalid Omid Aleph and Dalid Omid Beis.
You're talking about Rosh Hashanah, yes?
Yeah, but you should have it in the Marmakomos. Do you have the Marmakomos?
I don't have it. No, I'm sorry. No, but I'm going to get. I'll get the Gemara. That's good.
Okay, excellent. Anyways, if anybody else has it, it's Dalid Omid Aleph and Dalid Omid Beis. Either way, I'll try to read it as clearly as I can, so you'll get the main idea. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows: Tan Rabbanan, okay, Chayve Hadamin v'Harachin Hacharamin v'Hekdeshos Chatos v'Shamos Olos Shlamim Tzedakos u'Maisros v'Chor Maisro Pesach Leket Shikcho Peya Kivin She'avra Aleim Gimel Regalim over Bebal Ta'acher. Okay. What does that mean? It's a massive list, right? It took me, 20 minutes just to read this list, practically, right? This is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah we're on. It's on the bottom of Dalid Omid Aleph. Towards
Daf
the bottom.
what? I'm sorry, Daf what?
Dalid Omid
Aleph, 4a.
Okay.
Towards the bottom.
I have.
So Tan Rabbanan, so it's a whole list. Damim, Arachin, Charamim, Hekdeshos, Chatos, Hashamos, Olos, Shlamim. These are karbonos that we're familiar with. The most important word on the list is tzedakos, because that's what we're interested in. And then, it's surrounded by karbonos and arachin, and then comes maisros, bechor, maiser, pesach, leket shikcha, upeya, right? In this week's parsha, Emor that we just read, we read about leket upeya. So the rule is this: let's say you made a pledge, right? They had an appeal in shul. You made a pledge to bring an olah, or you made a pledge to give tzedakah. How much time do you have to fulfill that pledge?
Doesn't it matter the terms of the pledge?
Well, let's say you did. Let's say I'm talking about objectively speaking. In other words, you just made a pledge, and it wasn't part of the pledge itself. You didn't say 30 days, and you didn't say 5 years. You said I pledge. So what is the rule, right? That's kind of a neder. And the same thing.
Don't you have to say something before Yom Kippur and all your nedarim? So a neder is usually for a year. Why do you do all the maturim lach, machulim lach? Why do you do that?
No, that's not nedar. That's hataras nedarim.
Yeah. So how's that different?
No. We're talking about hataras nedarim means when you committed yourself, to a certain kind of practice, and then you realize that you're not able to either sustain that level, and you're going to violate, or you did violate, so you want to, release yourself from the neder. That's hataras nedarim.
So it has nothing to do with tzedakah.
No, you could make a neder of tzedakah, but
right. You can't take away what you promised.
Yeah, usually it's regular nedarim, and that's when you want to negate a neder. We're not talking about negating a neder. We're talking about what is the timetable in fulfilling, and it's not necessarily nedarim. Remember, it's nedarim, arachim. Let's say you did a ma'asaver. You have to bring a korban. How long do you have? What's the statute of limitation?
What's the expiration date?
What's the expiration date or the statute of limitations?
Something to do with the Yomim Tovim, the Shalosh Regalim.
Oh, good, excellent. Yeah, that's what the Gemara says. So that's the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Kivan she'avru aleim gimel regalim. If 3 regalim pass, and you didn't fulfill your arachin, your charamim, your hekdeshos, your chatos, your ashamos, your tzedakos, etc., then over b'bal ta'acher. Then you violate the prohibition of bal ta'acher nidro. Okay? So gimel regalim. Then there's another interesting debate. Rab Shimon Omer, gimel regalim kasidron. The Chagamatzos tchila. Rab Shimon was insistent, not he insisted, he understood that the halacha was insistent, that not just gimel regalim. Gimel regalim kasidra.
Like the Torah written.
Starting with Chag Pesach or Chag Matzos. So let's say you made a commitment or whatever, and you're obligated on Shavuos, right? So then you have more time, right? Because it goes all the way around, and then starting from the next Chag Matzos, Gimel Regalim. So you get like a year and 2/3.
Almost 2 years.
Right? All right. So what does the Gemara say? That's the Gemara. Rab Shimon Omer Gimel Regalim Kasidron. B'Chag Matzos Tchil. Rab Meir Omer Kivin She'avar Let Regal Echad over Bal Tach. Rab Meir disagrees. He says you have 1 regel. Okay, so let's say right now you made a neder. So after Shavuos you have till after Shavuos.
So he made a neder the day before Pesach, and then day after Pesach he sunk.
Sunk. It's a good motivation to reason, right? Okay. So this is a very interesting question, right? In general, isn't this an interesting question? What is the expiration date, as you put it, or the statute of limitation? I think more like, statute of limitations. You think more like an expiration date. It's interesting, but we're talking about the same thing. That's an interesting question because you.
Question is, what's the reason for the time limit in the first place?
Excellent. But before we even get to that, it's more complicated because 2 dapim later, or a daf and a half, the chazan has to turn the page. Now turn to Vav Amud Aleph.
Vav Amud Aleph. I'm there.
6a. You see the Gemara there? It says Beficha. There's another Gemara.
How far down is it?
I don't have the.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just don't have the text in front. I could get it.
Okay, that's okay.
You'll see Beficha Zu Tzedakah. It's like in the middle, as I recall.
Okay.
I'm not a pin test person. But
no, that's okay. I'll find it.
You have it there? You'll see the.
Not yet, but I'll find it. I'll find it.
Rava. So remember we said Motzas Asecha Tishmar, right? Yeah. So Beficha is one of the psukim in that context. So Beficha means what is something that you obligate yourself with your mouth? Zu tzedakah. Says the Gemara, Amarava utzedakah mechayev alala alter. Tzedakah, you have to discharge that obligation. You found it?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
My tama.
Yeah. Alter, my time, Dhakaimi aniyim, because the aniyim are present. You're there?
Yes, I have it.
What does it mean? Says the Gemara Pshita. Isn't that obvious? Ma'u desema kiven de binyan of the karbanos ksiva. Since the parsha is in the framework of dealing with karbanos, so you might think just like karbanos, the statute of limitation is ad avri Allah. Gimel regalim karbanos. So then, just like karbanos, you should have, the luxury of 3 regalim. Kamash malan hasam in the case of karbanos who detalid rachmana beregalim. The Torah connects it to regalim. Aval hacha tzedakah lo tashchichi aniyim, because aniyim are ubiquitous.
You mean they're expecting it?
Oh, so it's interesting that you say it that way, but yeah. The Gemara says in Megillah that they used to read the Megillah, when they had kfarim, these little villages. That's the first Mishnah and the first Sugya Megillah.
Yeah.
So they sometimes would read the Megillah. Usually they read it on Yudalid, and if it was a walled city on Tesvav. But the Mishnah says sometimes they read it on Yudalid, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, because of in the Kfarim, in the little towns where they didn't have a minyan, they would read it on Monday and Thursday. So the Gemara says, what happens if you read the Megillah early? Let's say on Yud Aleph or Yud Beis or Yud Gimel. What about the Suda? What about Mishloach Manos Ish L'Re'ehu? And what about Matanos Levyonim? Right? So the Gemara says when it comes to the Suda and Matanos and Mishloach Manos, that's on Yud Daled, no matter what. Even if you read in a little kfar on Yud Gimel or Yud Beis, you're still going to have the Suda and Mishloach Manos on Yud Daled. However, when it comes to Matanos Levyonim, by the way, this is another proof that it's a separate category. When it comes to Matanos Levyonim, you always give Matanos Levyonim on the day that you read the Megillah. Why? Says the Gemara, because Eineim Shalaniim Nesunos Lemikra, or Eineim Shalevyonim Nesuos Lemikra Megillah. That's when they expect
to enjoy, to celebrate Purim. Yeah.
No, I don't. Right. I don't think it's the celebration part. It's more like, they're circling. It's like, the expectation. They're anticipating to disappoint that would be devastating. I think that's
of course.
Anyway, so that's why when you just said now they're expecting it reminded me of that Gemara. So in a way, this is what Gemara is saying in Rosh Hashanah. Gemara is saying, according to Rabbi, that the time frame for fulfilling tzedakah is because the Hakayim Yaniyim, Hashchichi Yaniyim.
Yeah.
But there's only one problem. The two Gemaras contradict each other. What did the previous Gemara say? A whole long list, right? Arachim, Charamim, Chatas and Asham and Shlamim and Ola and Maestros and everything, including tzedakos, are Gimel Regalim. And all of a sudden, it's practically a daf later in the same Masechta, in Rosh Hashanah, Rava says, La'alter, the chiv is immediate.
Maybe that one tzedakah wasn't tzedakah l'aniyim. You can give tzedakah to a basic Knesset, you can give tzedakah to
First of all, I think it's a great answer. And the relationship between those two things is really an important issue. And again, if you were Bedochak, you could give that answer. I think it's an interesting answer. It also is a very sensible answer, but there's no evidence for it. And I'm not aware of anybody who says it. It's something to think about, but there seems to be a stira. Anyway, the Bali Tosas noticed the stira. If you look at Tosas on Dalid, Oman Aleph, Dira Maskal Tzedakos Umaisros. So Tosas says the following. You have that in the Mar Makomos that we're looking. If those of you who have Mar Makomos, it's the next Mar Makom. We're still on page 2. And
which Tosas is it?
Tzedakos. On the side.
Yes.
And Avdal.
I have it.
Yeah. I didn't Rava say a daf and a half later, alter. So it's a stira, it's a contradiction. The Tosa says, no, Hanimili de Kaimianim. Avalo Mechayev lahadure basrayu kozman shelo overgimel regalim. This is a very remarkable Tosas. Tosa says, when the Gemara says that according to Rabbi, you have to give right away because of Kaimianim, it's not what you think it is. When you read the Gemara, you're thinking you always have to give right away because there are always ani. Like Oni is an Evion is a permanent state in the world, so there are always aniyim. So what the Gemara is saying is you have to give it immediately. There's an immediate need, and you have to give it immediately. That's not the pshat, says Tosas. Tosas says the way to read the Gemara on Vav is in light of the Gemara on Dav Dalet, namely. Really, the internal obligation to give what you call the expiration date, what I call the statute of limitations, is Gimel Regalim. However, but the Kaimi Aniyim, when the Aniyim are standing and they're waiting and they're expecting and they're anticipating, that changes everything. That speeds up the timetable.
But I don't think that's what Tosas is saying.
One second. So then Tosas says, parach pshita, but the Gemara says pshit. How can it be so pshita? We just found it a steer in the Gemaras. Umishani Maud the same whole binyan the karbanos kseva avra gimel regalim ke karbanos. And the Gemara said, you might think it's like karbanos. You have 3 regalim. We do have 3 regalim in a case where it's not b'dekayim yaniyim. Hainu says Tosas afilu hecha dekayim yaniyim. The thought was in the Gemara that even if there are plenty of aniyim begging and demanding, even then you have a statute of gimel regalim to make do on your pledge. And then he says, "Ve'ein lefarish hadika amar over la'alter hainu asay kedash kam bachrini the regal echad over basay imkein avla nemer adavar regal echad kekorban." He said there could have been another answer to this question, and that would have been to say that maybe you violate the lav of lo sa'acher after gimel regalim, but maybe the mitzvah saseh of motzah sasecha tishmor, that would be immediate. So we're talking about 2 different things, not 2 different tzedakas, which was your very good idea, but 2 different aspects of tzedakah, of nidrei tzedakah, the asay and the law. Tosafos says, no, I don't think that's correct. We're going to see in a minute that the Rashba actually takes up Tosafos's suggestion. The reason he does, because he really didn't like what Tosafos had to offer instead, and I'll explain why in just a minute.
Nobody.
So I think that there are 2
differences. That in one case you're really supposed to do it immediately, but if you forgot,
no, we're not about forgetting.
And you're not over al ta'acher until 3 regalim go by. In other words, if you pledge something, you should give it right away. But if somebody forgot, then he has 2 regalim.
No, right. I mean, that's a logical thing to say, but that's not. That's not what the language of the Gemara says. Right? The Gemara just says, remember, let's look at the list. No, logically, what you're saying is eminently reasonable, but it's chai damim harachim charam teishos chatos hashamas halashlamim stakos maestros chor meiser pesach like a chikopeya kivin sha'avru gimel regalim over bebal ta'acher.
Yeah, but doesn't mean
what you're saying
doesn't mean he doesn't have an obligation, because we also, I think it's someplace else in the Torah that you shouldn't put off when you make a nether.
No, yeah, well, I mean the psukim and tova sharloti. We discussed this when we learned.
Why is there an assumption?
Tova sharloti dor mishatidor to shalem. That's what it says. In other words,
why is there an assumption
of implementation? It's better not to be noder if you're not going to fulfill. That's the issue. I'm sorry, Rabbi Roth?
Why is there an assumption of urgency with regard to aniyim when there are some community entities that are obligated to provide for the aniyim, so that would eliminate the urgency?
Well, right. We're not saying that the aniyim are solely dependent upon you, but what we are saying is that somehow the presence of so let me explain. I think there are 2 ways to understand Tosafos. A moderate way and a more, not radical, but I think a more ambitious way, or a more, conceptually significant way. The moderate way is to say, listen, there's like an open question here. You have a halachic obligation. We all understand the principle of zrizin makdim l'mitzvos, right? It's better not to push off if you don't need to. And even from an obligation point of view, the idea that the obligation, it's egregious to delay. Part of what a mitzvah is, it's a spiritual opportunity, and spiritual opportunity implies, a certain kind of, enthusiasm and treating it as if it's an opportunity, and so on. Or no. Really, the problem, when it comes to statute of limitations or timing of a mitzvah, is that, we're talking about mitzvah saseh, or obligations, and as long as you are not negating a mitzvah, like you're not being mevatel a mitzvah, you're not, rejecting or dismissing a mitzvah, you're fine. Of course, if you push it off indefinitely, and there's no timetable, then, that's obviously not practically going to work. There's a statute of limitation beyond which, if you don't do it, it's not that you're abstaining from doing it, you're rejecting it. You are like closing the door on it. So what you could say from that point of view is that, within a certain mitzvos, there also might be other factors. In other words, if there are no aniyim around, but I have to give tzedakah, I have to mail a check to somebody. So then I have a certain amount of time, until that time, I'm not abstaining or rejecting, the mitzvah. I have, gimel regalim, and that's perfectly fine. But if there are niyim and they're there, and I have the means, and they have, and there's the opportunity, then in some respect, delaying in that situation is being mevatel a mitzvah saseh. It's not just, refusing, to fulfill. It's also, in some respects, being mevatel the mitzvah. So you could say that the factor of kaimi aniyim is a factor which determines, at what point you are not implementing the mitzvah, as opposed to when you are kind of turning your back or dismissing or being mevatel the mitzvah. That's the difference. Kaimi aniyim, if you have the opportunity to do it now, or the urgency to do it now, then ignoring that is more egregious. And if there's no confrontation or experience, right, then the timetable is the timetable that distinguishes or discerns between fulfilling the assay and being mevatel the assay. But I think that there's another factor in light of everything that we've been discussing in Tzedakah, a better way to explain what Tosfos is saying. And that is that there are two aspects, two dimensions of Tzedakah. There is the mitzvah saseh, which is a mitzvah like all mitzvos. As we discussed, according to the Rambam, even ani chavero is, even another poor person is obligated to give tzedakah, just like he's obligated to hear shofar, just like he's obligated to sit in the sukkah. He's obligated to the mitzvah of tzedakah, right? Pasach tiftach, or nasum titain, is that kind of a mitzvah. And as far as that
even
is
a pruta.
What?
Right?
Yeah.
Even a pruta.
Correct. But as far as that is concerned, an obligation that comes from within. It's on what I said before. It's on your to-do list. You have a mitzvah to-do list, So tzedakah is on your to-do list. How long can it wait and stay on your to-do list? When does the obligation? When does it expire? Right. The answer is gimel regal. However, what we've been trying to explain is that when there's an urgency, when there's a specific ani, when there's an encounter between two people, that already takes tzedakah from mitzvah to chiyuv, from yoredeya, isur v'heter, to choshen mishpat. That's when the ani turns into a balcho, a malva, and the ashir, the donor, the nosing, turns into like a lova. That's only under, within the Jewish community. It's only, b'dekaimi aniyim. Where did the Rambam get this idea about kol malim einav, that you're not allowed to turn your back on him when he's there? I think from this Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, when the Ra'ah, quoted by the Ritva, says, why this is not mitzvah seishamat and schar b'tzeda, I'll tell you why. Because the mechayev is not just the mitzvah, it's maksoram shel aniyim, the needs of the ani. Where did he get that from? I think, personal theory, I'm totally speculating, I have no evidence for it. I think it's from this Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. I think it's a very powerful statement if you read it this way. Rava says, chayev la'alter, right? The kaimi, the aniyim are there. It's like I said, in response to the Chazin's comment about Mikra Megillah. Aineim shel aniyim nesuos leMikra Megillah. To ignore that is, number one, a bittul, not just an ikiyum, but more than that, it's what changes everything, as I say, from Yoredeya to Choshen Mishpat. Oh, that's what Tosfos is saying. Tosfos is saying, the list on Daf Daled, look what else is on the list. Chatos, Asham, Ola, Shlamim, Charamim, Arachin, all chovos. All mitzvos, basically. Right? There's no the hekdesh is is guilting you into giving. These are things, donations or obligations, but they come from within, and they have a timetable. Gimel regalim. Gimel regalim is considered to be maybe Kasidron, maybe not. It's considered an interest. It's like an extended period of time. Like you went through the experiences of the Gimel regalim, maybe even Kasidron. Beyond that, it's like a different tkufa. in the world of time and halacha is a very interesting thing too. Like, a week, there's the shloshim yom, there's all sorts of different categories, a year, there's the tkufa of the Gimel Regalim Kasidron. These are different, ways, different milestones. So it's Gimel Regalim. It's a chovas mitzvah hagavra. But the Gemara Rosh Hashanah Davav, Amar Rava, chayiv, b'tzedakah chayiv la'alter the kaimi aniyim. That's not talking about that. It's tzedakah, but that's different. That's if there's been a kaimi aniyim, then the mechayiv isn't the to-do list of the nosing, right? It's the demands and the Baal Chov status of the Makabel. That's a different story. So that's what Tosa is saying. Tosa says there are two different mechayvim. When there's b'dekayim yaniyim, if there are no aniyim around, but you have to find a good charity, you've got to Gimel Regalim. But when the ani is demanding and he has a right to, and you're basically rejecting him, then it's altar. Okay, so what's fascinating is, with this we're going to stop for today, is that the Rajba didn't see it at all. And in my opinion, when we finish this up next week, I'm going to try to show you 3 Rajbas and basically 2 or 3 Rans. I think that the Ran and the Rajba implicitly really argue about the whole, this whole question, to what extent is tzedakah financial, obligation, that's a chi of mammon, as a result, of course, of v'ahavta l'reacha and kol Yisrael ha'revim and pasah, all these other things. But to what extent does it really convert into, kind of legal financial obligation, or does it always retain the initial character of a, mitzvah? Namely, a mitzvah that is anchored in a chovas hagabra and mostly ben olam lamakom. So what's fascinating is that the Rajba did not, he quotes Tosas. If anybody has the I hope you have, if not, we should have for next week, the Marmakomos that were handed out last week, or that were sent last week. Do people have that or not? If not, I'm not going to read from it. I'll just tell you what he says.
It was sent again this week.
What's that?
It was sent again this week too.
Oh, well, it's great. Okay, great. It's a little bit my fault. It came out, I didn't have my name on it for some reason, and it starts in the middle of a piece. The first word is tzedakos, so just ignore that. But the Rajba quotes the Tosas. This is the Rajba, by the way, in Rosh Hashanah. Kosovo Tosas writes, is the first line. The Tosas says that the distinction is whether there are aniyim pressing you or not. Over the altar. That's what Rava said. The Kaman, says the Rajba. Listen to the question. Rajba says, I have many questions. I have a lot of difficulty with this answer of Tosas. Listen to the problem. Dim Isa, if what Tosas is saying is correct, ki kama rachmana delo avar the karbanos at shiavru gimel regalim. So if the Torah is telling us that you only violate Baal Ta'acher, if you don't bring your korban, after 3 regalim, hainu mishum delo atra chala ad gimel regalim. That's because we're trying, we don't want to impose too much effort upon him. The kivin shekain, but if that's the case, ilu isa b'Yerushalayim, let's say he happens to be in Yerushalayim, the afar she'la korban, and he's got access to an animal, yavra lala altar. The koi mikdash, the language is amazing. The mikdash is there, but kaimi kohanim, the kohanim are present. The kaima behema, the animals are present. What's he saying? The first time you read the Rajba, you don't even understand what he's saying. What's he talking about? Tosas that he's quoting isn't talking about karbanos. Tosas is talking about tzedakah. Tosas says if there are aniyim, you have to give right away. If there are no aniyim, and you have to mail it to tzedakah, you have gimel regalim. What does he have to? The Rajba says, I can't accept that answer. It's riddled with flaws. Why? Because according to this, if you're in Yerushalayim, right, and you have access to the Mikdash and Kohanim and a Behema, then you should have to bring a korban right away. What was Ma'inyan? This is the parsha of Ma'inyan Shemitah. It's Har Sinai, right? So, what is this? But it's very simple what he's asking. The Rajba read the Gemara. The Rajba read the Tosas. He didn't think that Tosas was saying something singular about tzedakah, b'dekayim yanim, the way I was interpreting. I've been interpreting b'dekayim yanim. The aniyim are like the Ritva. Machsoram shel aniyim l'chayim. It converts a Yoredeya din into a Mishpah din. Right? It makes him your Balchov. He's a poor man and you're a wealthy man. All of a sudden you owe him money.
Gemara has some discussions about a Kohen's right to grab truma under certain circumstances.
No, yeah, that's Makirei Kuhuna.
Would we apply the same thing to an ani?
Well,
somebody made a general donation of money.
Yeah, but I don't want to get into that. That's a great question for the broader issue. That remind me about the next week. What you're talking about is the principle of Makirei Kuhuna. And there is an idea of, Shevet Aniyim, just like Shevet, Kahuna, like Matnos Aniyim compared with, the Chi of Maisros for Levium and the Chi of Truma for Kohen. That's a great question. I mentioned before that we're talking about three different categories, Nidrei Tzedakah, the Aseh of Tzedakah, the Lav of Tzedakah. There are also other tzedakos, right? There's the tzedakos of Eretz Yisrael, leket, shikha, peah, matnos aniyim. In some respects, shmita, every 7 years, at least aspects of shvius tishmetena unatashta, right? Psukim that we're reading in the parashas that we're reading right now. So it's fascinating. If you want a full picture of philanthropy, why does some of it express itself, in the world of Tavua of Eretz Yisrael? I think it's very, there's a very good reason for it. But so that your question is related to that. Maybe we'll get back to it. But I just want to conclude with the Rajba. So the Rajba basically understood that what is Tosfos saying? B'kaimi aniyim yechayiv miyad, b'lo kaimi aniyim yav gimel regalim. He didn't understand that that's a din in the aniyim and in tzedakah, namely that the aniyim can demand, that the confrontation with the ani is a machayiv, machsorim shel aniyim. What did he understand? No, all of these issues are the same question. You have a halachic obligation. You have a mitzvah. What's the statute of limitations? Is it immediate? Or is it after one regel? Or after gimel regalim? What is the statute of limitations? So when the Gemara says on Vavam and Aleph, and Tosfos says that that's what's koveya, but the kaim yaniyim, it's an example. What it means is we don't force you to implement your mitzvah obligations immediately. It would be too much of an effort to impose upon you to do it right away. We give you some leeway. We give you a time frame. But if you have the opportunity, it's reason magdim the mitzvah. If you have the opportunity to do it right away, because kaim yaniyim, it's not a din in tzedakah. It's a din in all these things. Then you should do it immediately. Says Tosfos, says Rashba. That's what the Gemara is saying. That's what Tosfos thinks the Gemara is saying. Then that should be true about karbanos. So if you're in the Beis HaMikdash and you owe a korban chatas or an asham or an ola, and you're in Yerushalayim and you have a behema and there are kohanim and they're ready to go, well, you shouldn't be waiting gimel regalim. It's the equivalent of the kaim yaniyim. But Bali Tosfos wouldn't agree with that. The Bali Tosfos, that's what the
Karbanos and tzedakah.
What?
There's different. Karbanos, it has an immediate obligation maybe on you. Tzedakah, you may have in mind when you gave the tzedakah that you have this 3 regalim.
No, I would say better. The karbanos is an internal obligation. It's on the no-same, right? I owe an asham, I owe an ola, I owe a chatas. That's between me and the Rebbeinu Shalom. I have to, it's on my to-do list. What is the time frame of my to-do list, my mitzvah to-do list? But what Tosfos is saying about tzedakah is, forget about the to-do list. The ani has rights of his own, and he's there and he needs. There's no comparable.
The to-do list is only in a vacuum when there's nothing pressing on the other side.
There's no comparable b'dekayim yaniyim for Tosfos in karbanos. But the Rajba was so convinced, I'll show you in the other 2 Rajbas, that, tzedakah remains anchored and rooted as a mitzvah, not as a chiyuv mamon. It may take the form of chiyuv mamon, but it's always has the character of a mitzvah. And therefore, if there's a din of b'dekayim yaniyim, then there's a parallel din in korbanos. There's nothing unusual about tzedakah in that respect, says the Rashba. So what I'm going to try to show next week is that two different issues, and then we'll finish with this topic. And we'll go on to some other, community, oriented issues. Two issues I want to talk about next week. One is safek. Let's say you have a safek obligation to give tzedakah. Is that safek mamon, motzi mechaber olav araya, or is that safek iser, safek daraisa l'chumra? You're not sure if you have to give more or less tzedakah, or if you gave tzedakah. That's one question. Number two, when we say there's enforcement, what do we mean by enforcement? Verbal pressure? Actually, you can, physically, you can force him to comply. Can you also just confiscate his property? And can you confiscate his property when he's not there? And can you confiscate his property if he's intellectually not there? By which I mean he's incompetent, like a shota. So I want to talk about that, and I want to try to show that the Ran and the Rashba represent two extremes in this question about tzedakah. How much mamon, how much yoredeya iser b'heter. Okay, so that will be the agenda, Mirz Hashem, for next week when we continue, and hopefully we'll finish this, bigger topic. But if you can all get, hold on to the second group of marmakom, both actually, the first and second group of marmakomos relating to tzedakah, we will be needing them next week. It's always helpful if they're accessible.
Shkoyach, Rabbi. Thank you.